All right. Hey, everybody. Welcome. I am really excited to be speaking to someone who has been a pretty long-term Facebook friend, although today is the first time I've actually spoken to you, Karen. But it's great to actually be able to speak to you. Thank you for being willing to have this conversation. So Karen, can you introduce yourself a little bit for listeners? Tell them a little about yourself, and then also like about this chapter that you submitted to this book and about the book and all that. I'll just let you kind of get us going here.
Sure. I am research professor of English and Christianity and Culture at Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary. I have been there for 1 year, finishing out my first year after teaching for 21 years at Liberty University. So I'm an English professor. I also write a lot. I write books and I write a lot of opinion essays. I'm a columnist at Religion News Service. And so, yeah, I have lots of thoughts and do enjoy writing, but really am primarily a reader of great literature. And I love talking about that too. But that's because it teaches me so much about people and ideas, and
Yeah.
it's all connected.
Yeah. And I think I'd seen something you had posted recently too, and about how that Christians should read more and read more literature. And why do you think that's important?
Well, literature, good literature, great literature, addresses the questions that are eternal and everlasting about the human condition and human existence. And I think that we learn so much more about what it means to be human that goes so far beyond our own time and place. We're so limited in our experiences, but seeing some of these enduring questions through the eyes of people who are very different from us or lived in different times and places helps us to contextualize our own questions and problems. And so much of what I see going on out there in the social media world, or just in conversations with people, or even politically, it seems based on a very limited understanding of our moment and our time and our place. I mean, so many of the big issues that we're struggling with, even the pandemic, is something that is addressed over and over again in literature over the centuries, because about every 100 years there's a huge pandemic, and
Right.
we're not alone. So that's just one example of how much we can understand about ourselves in this moment by reading about and reading from the perspective of other times and places.
Yeah. No, I love that. I agree. I think what I thought was interesting about it was I had interviewed. Do you know who David Bentley Hart is?
Yes.
So I interviewed him a few months ago, and that was exactly his thing as well. He was saying that that we'd be better served reading less theology books and
Mm.
reading more really great literature. And he had a very similar kind of response to what you said, like with the value of just experiencing life through the eyes and experiences of other people. Certainly when they're able to tell stories in ways that are creative and artful and beautiful, and they get in touch with sort of the human experience and emotion and things like that. Um, it can really tell us a whole lot more about
Mhm.
the world we live in and our connection with God and with one another. And
Mhm.
yeah, I think that's really, really true. There's a lot of rich literature out there. Just real quick, I know this is taking us in a different direction we expected to go in, but
No.
I just while we're talking about it, are there any are there like a handful of books that you find are really helpful in that respect, or that you would recommend?
Yeah, and before I answer that, you've hit me in my sweet spot here, but because I read a lot of theology and philosophy, and those things are important, and I know David Bentley Hart does as well. But the difference, I think a lot of people don't understand this, is that there's a difference between reading material that informs us, which
Hmm.
these works do, but literature and art don't just inform us, they form us. They give us an experience that is much more than information. And so when we read literature, we're seeing the world through someone else's eyes offers a kind of experience that's very different from just reading, like, oh, this is what life was like for a poor woman in 19th century England. It's very, very different. So speaking of a poor woman in 19th century England, one of my favorite books to recommend, and I just happen to have published a new edition of it with my own introduction and notes, is Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre.
Mm.
It is, if I had to recommend one great literary work for people to read, it would probably be that. And it's, what people need to know is that it's not just a love story, which people might think. It's really an allegory of a modern Christian soul trying to find her way and be who God has called her to be. And that is applicable to all of us.
Yeah.
So, Jane Eyre. And I've written several books about books, and so a lot of my beloved books are there. And I have a whole series of classics from B&H that introduce these works of literature to people. So I, of course, would start with those. Jane Eyre, Frankenstein, Sense and Sensibility, and Heart of Darkness are the 4 volumes that are out now.
Oh, wow. Those sound great. That sounds really, really cool. Now, here's what's fascinating. I didn't plan this, but in some ways, I think actually this is a great introduction to our topic because, um, like, one of the things that I've found is that in my own spiritual journey as a follower of Christ, um, the value of sort of, oh, there's a couple of things that I think are kind of mixed into what we're talking about here. Like in the same way we would approach literature and other writings and put ourselves in somebody else's shoes and see life through their eyes. That's a very important skill, I think, for us in theological conversations as well, right? To not just see things the way I see them, but to be willing to put myself in somebody else's shoes and try to see things from their perspective. It's less about right and wrong and more about trying to understand where the other person is coming from. Um, so that's part of it. And I think also the other thing that's fascinating about it is the kind of overlap is something I feel like in a way we've lost in our Christian faith, certainly in the West. It feels like I think, I don't know if you agree with me on this or not. So let me know what you think. I feel like sometimes we have strayed so far into the realm of certainty. In other words, like our Christianity has been much more about having the right answers and having the right information to the point where we have abandoned our um, sense of awe and wonder and mystery and coming to a topic like theology, which is the description and discussion and study of a being beyond all words and imagination. Um, and the ability to talk about that topic and use phrases like, I think, or I don't know, or I believe, you know what I mean? But with this, sort of holding loosely to that. Like for me personally, I really value conversations about theology where we are more comfortable in that realm of mystery and awe and wonder and less sure of ourselves. You know what I'm saying? So I don't know, what do you think about that just in general?
I completely agree. I think, as a student of human history, sort of through the study of literature, one of the things that I've just seen so much is that we tend to swing from sort of one pendulum, one side of the pendulum swings from one side to the other, from one extreme to the other.
Yeah.
So the Middle Ages was a time of emphasis on kind of the supernatural and mystery and awe and wonder, and then we get the Enlightenment,
Yeah.
and I certainly love my science. I love I love the way science has made our lives, safer and more comfortable. Yet we can go too far and assume that we can be certain about things that we were never meant to be certain about on this
Yeah.
side of heaven. And so, I do think that pendulum might be coming back and resting a little bit more in the middle, which is where virtue resides in moderation between um, excess and deficiency. And so, as a Protestant Christian, specifically Baptist, I certainly believe in the truth of the Bible and the truth of Christ, and that I can know for certain that I am saved. Yet that leaves that, that doesn't answer every single question about our lives. There's so many more questions, and that's to mistake or assume that having these really big questions answers all of the other ones that come our way is, I mean, that's to mistake earth for heaven, right? That's
Yeah.
to mistake mortal life for the immortal realm. We're not there yet. So there are lots of questions and lots of opportunities to wonder and to think and to not know. And I think that's wonderful. I don't think that's, I mean, it would be kind of boring if we knew all the answers.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think, yeah, for me anyway, like when we approach this topic, and this is kind of getting to why I wanted to talk to you. There is this phenomenon going on. Truthfully, I guess this sort of deconstruction phenomenon has been going on for probably a lot longer than we even realize. But I mean, for me, I think I've been aware of it for at least the last 10 or 15 years. But it seems like in maybe the last 3 or 4 years, um, deconstruction, that terminology of deconstruction, um, and the phenomenon where I think maybe we're noticing it more. We were talking before we hit record, when you have more of these high profile people, right? So people that these names, you've read their books, you've been to their conferences, you've listened, read their blog or whatever, or watch their YouTube channel or listen to their podcast. And these people that are Christian, sort of spokespersons, one by one, we've lately seen several people, Joshua Harris and Martin Unger and, Derek Webb. I could go down the list, Beth Moore recently, and so I think because we see more of this happening, it starts to create this sort of, I think it creates some uncertainty and confusion and fear with a lot of people, like, well, what's going on here? Why is this happening? Why does it seem like it's happening? Not just to maybe people that I know, who I go to church with, people in my family or community, but even some of these people that are like, they're supposed to be sort of the examples and the leaders. They're also kind of either asking questions or doubting, or some of them very publicly saying they're no longer Christians, or just saying, I don't believe certain things anymore that are kind of pillars of kind of a Christian theology. And so seeing this happen more and more, it does create some anxiety and some questions with a lot of people, and knowing how to respond to that can be really challenging, I think. So you have contributed a chapter. There's a book which is out now. It is actually
Yes.
published, right? Called "Before You Lose Your Faith," and it's a collection of articles and chapters, I guess, contributions by a variety of authors, and you're one of them, which is attempting, I think, to provide some kind of a response to that. So can you talk a little bit about that? Like, your contribution to that book. Why is that book important? Why is that book, a necessary thing right now? And kind of like what's the purpose and the point of that book?
Yeah, the book was a project of the Gospel Coalition, and it was released during their conference a couple of weeks ago, and given, I think, free to all who registered. And now, of course, it's available the usual ways. But it really was a collection of essays from different writers, bringing from their different experiences, addressing some of the issues that we've seen over and over are the sources of some of this doubt and deconstruction. Of course, there are lots of reasons why people doubt or question their Christian assumptions or walk away from the faith, or but there certainly are some major areas, such as sexuality or hypocrisy. And there are about 15 chapters, I think, in the book covering different topics, including an introduction that just kind of talks about, well, what is deconstruction, because even that's not that well defined.
Right.
And my contribution, drawing on my experience, I'm not someone who's really deconstructed my faith in any sense of the word, but I have been teaching college students at a conservative evangelical institution for over 20 years. And so I've seen a lot of students encounter different stumbling blocks. And in my particular context, teaching in a university, it has most often been anti-intellectualism. students, they're in a college or university environment and they're learning and they're supposed to use critical thinking, yet many times they might come from a background where that has been discouraged, or they encounter even in their classes eh, what they see as anti-intellectualism. And so, because even Christian colleges and universities aren't immune to that. Some
Yeah.
would say they're not at all. And so my chapter, draws on some of those experiences that I've had, and just makes an argument that similar to what we just talked about, that there is so much room for wonder and questions, and to not ask those, to not encourage that, I think really does go against the example that Christ sets for us,
Yeah.
which is a hospitality. He offered a hospitality toward hard questions. He asked a lot of hard questions
Yes, he did.
himself.
Yes, he did.
And so we really need to follow the model of Christ, and so many others in the Bible who love the Lord their God with their hearts and
Yeah.
soul and minds. And so yeah, that's not the stumbling block for everyone, but it's certainly one that I've seen a lot and wanted to address that in the book.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. And you know what? I have only read. I have not read the entire book. I think they released like a 40-page sort of a sampler of like maybe the first 40 pages. So I read that, and I did, and then I was sent your chapter specifically before the interview, so I could read your chapter. And I really, really appreciated what you wrote, actually. And when I was reading it, I was like nodding a lot and going, "Yep, I really like what you wrote." And I really agree with you. I think um, so if I understand correctly what you're saying, like it's we shouldn't be encouraging people who have questions to not question. We don't want to say to them, stop asking questions, right? We want to
Right.
say like what Jesus said was, hey, you got some questions, I got some questions too. And Jesus seemed to be really comfortable with questions. In fact, I think someone have said that out of like the 7 or 8 questions he was asked in the Gospels, I don't think he even answered one of them, and usually he responded with a question of his own, and so and even other times he would even ask a question and then just let it hang and not wait around for the person to figure it out, to let people think about it and chew on it, and so I really appreciate that. Actually, I love that about Jesus. It's like I think we as Christians could uh, take some cues from that. Like it's okay to let people have questions and to let them wrestle these things out and kind of trust the Holy Spirit to help them, process and wrestle through some of those things. Not that we don't help them if they have questions, but it's okay, for people to have questions. So I really appreciate that as a response. I think that's a good thing. Um, so can we talk a little bit about? I know you and I talked before we hit record that you don't really feel like you're an expert in deconstruction, and I understand that. Um, but you do have some experience in it. Like you shared a link with me on your Facebook page where you had asked a question back in March, just kind of taking an informal poll of your followers and students. Have they deconstructed and what was their experience on that? And that was a pretty eye-opening post. I mean, you had 255 responses to that question so far.
Plus private messages.
Yeah, yeah. So talk a little bit about that. Like, first of all, why did you ask that question? And then let's talk a little bit about some of the responses and even maybe some of those private messages.
Yeah. Well, I asked the question specifically because I was about to do an interview like this on the book, and I don't remember what the question was given to me ahead of time, that I just kind of wanted to flesh out. So I wasn't expecting to get so many responses. I even asked specifically about my own students or people I knew in real life because I wanted to really be more reminded of people I already knew, but I got so many more responses. Um, and again, it did show that people mean different things by deconstruction,
Yes,
and that's fine. I think and even the examples that you gave earlier about the different people who've publicly said something, they're kind of a range. Most of them have walked away from the Christian faith, and others, like Beth Moore, have just simply, separated from a denomination.
right.
Um, but I think, I think that altogether those responses, because again I was mainly polling my former students who come from and were immersed in a certain kind of environment, um most of the responses overall, not all, but I would say most, were actually encouraging, because what I was seeing expressed was an examination of what once had been underlying assumptions. And I think that's really what we all need to do. And going back to the, talking about the people who leave publicly and how that can be disappointing and even devastating. Of course, it's a cliche that, we put our trust in Jesus, not in people. And that is true. But we are people of community. We are shaped by our culture. We're shaped by the people that we choose as our influences. And so to pretend that it doesn't matter when these things happen, it would be foolish. But on the other hand, to pretend that what we believe, to just assume that what we believe is a belief and not an assumption, is
Right.
also foolish. We need to ask ourselves. I do this all the time, about some of the topics that I feel the most passionate about. I will now and then stop and say, okay, do I really believe this and why? I have to remind myself, because there's so much noise out there, and it's so easy for us to just keep marching along and not think about why we believe what we believe. It's really important that we stop and do that.
Yeah, absolutely.
And
And
I kind of strayed from your original question, but
no, that's
some
fine.
some of those responses, they were talking about specific instances, but I was amazed at how many of them were positive. I mean, there was
Yeah.
one message that I got that I'll share, that was from a student of mine that I had, and I had no idea. And she sent me in the message about how badly she had been abused by her mother and her pastor father.
Mm,
And while she was a student of mine, I didn't know that this was going on, and through her whole life. And yet, somehow, through that, she has come through with her faith strong and intact. But despite going through all this, and I think that person's faith is probably as strong, or as stronger than anyone we might know, because of what she had to question in those
yeah.
experiences that she had.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think it's good to acknowledge um, that deconstruction is different for almost everybody, right? Their reasons for deconstructing are always going to be, different. I mean, I have over the last couple of years talked to a lot of people. I actually put together this program called Square One, which is designed to help people. It's like a 12-week course community
Mm,
that helps people who are deconstructing their faith, whatever reason that is, and tries to walk through the deconstruction process with them, sort of step by step, and then walk them into a reconstruction process as well. And so one of the things that I've noticed, by the way, this is kind of shocking to sometimes when I tell people this, but I usually take anywhere from 12 to 15 people at a time through one of these 12-week
mm,
courses. There's almost every time at least one, sometimes three or four pastors in
mm,
these groups, and we're talking they preach on Sunday morning, and they'll say, if my church knew I was in this course, if they knew I
mm,
was deconstructing, I would lose my job.
mm,
So, I mean, I think I've had at least one in almost every, and this is like the eighth
mm.
time I've done this. So, but again, sorry, I'm digressing a little bit. So,
No,
but,
this
but
is I think this is important for you to.
yeah,
I'm glad you're sharing this. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And so, but I guess my point is that when I talk to people and they have their conversations, and in the beginning we kind of just introduce ourselves, and they kind of tell their story. Yeah, everyone's got a different entry point, right? So for some of them, it might be something like you're saying, where they've suffered some abuse by a youth pastor or a pastor, whether that's verbal or physical or sexual, whatever. That's pretty extreme. In fact, a lot of times in those cases, I'll encourage them to get some therapy, because I'm not a therapist. That's not what I'm doing. But if there's something really deep you need to, to process, you need to get some help with that. For other people, theologically, it's anything from, I'm not sure I think the Bible is inerrant and infallible. I'm not sure I believe in eternal torment. Suffering in general in the world. How can a good God allow suffering? There's all kinds of different entry points. But in a way, it's also like a little Jenga puzzle, where it kind of doesn't matter which thread you pull first. once you start pulling on one thread, some of the other ones are going to eventually
Mm.
kind of follow. And so, and then that's usually what people find themselves in, is this place of, I think a lot of people that I've talked to who deconstructed kind of feel like it's happening to them. You know what I mean? And so a lot of times when I will see people responding, talking about other people who are not deconstructing, who don't really know anyone deconstructing, and they'll talk about deconstruction in sort of terms like stop it or don't do that, or before you deconstruct, do this. I'm like, what do you mean before? Like I had a choice? Like I didn't realize I could decide not to. So for a lot of people, that's their feeling. They feel like I just started asking some questions, and the next thing I know, I'm like, I'm questioning this and that and the other thing, and I don't know what to do. So a lot of them, they feel kind of out of control. They feel like it's something that's kind of happening to them, and they can feel very helpless, right? So yeah, I think that was really interesting in your thread that you had similar things where different people, some people were like, hey, I'm gay, or and sometimes it's even mild. It's to the point of like, I was a Baptist and now I'm an Anglican. And which on one level, I guess that's deconstruction, because, if you're a Baptist, you believe a certain thing. I'm licensed and ordained Southern Baptist, grew up Southern Baptist. So I totally understand that. And, but then my wife and I spent some time in the Vineyard movement. And so, which is very different, kind of charismatic and right. So there were some shifts in some practices and some beliefs, but on a minor scale, right? And so there's different entry points to deconstruction, and there's different experiences. People sometimes go from just being sort of, within the family of Christianity, they move from the Methodist house to the Baptist house, or from the Baptist house to the Pentecostal house, or the charismatic house to the Brethren or Quaker or whatever. They're still Christians, right? But for them, it was still a strange experience, or
Right.
a volatile experience to go from I was raised a certain way to believe certain things. Now I've deconstructed those certain beliefs and practices, and now I'm still a Christian, but I kind of just live over here in this other camp. And then the extreme level of it is, and I think this is where I think there's the biggest concern, is that you have people who begin that process, whatever their starting point is, whatever their first sort of thread that they pull is, whatever their, whatever kind of gets them going in this direction. And then they do end up basically just deconstructing to the point where there's nothing left. And now they don't have faith in anything. They don't believe in anything. They've rejected everything. And they don't believe in God. They don't believe in the Bible. They don't believe in Jesus. They don't believe in anything. And that honestly is something, that's the reason why I started that course, was that I wanted to help people who are having these kinds of questions, that wherever they land, that I think you don't have to deconstruct Jesus. You don't have to let go of Christ. Whatever other things you question and doubt, I think you can do so honestly without letting go of Jesus. And that was my goal, was just like, hey, don't leave the family here, right? There's no, I don't think you need to go that far. So I've been trying to help people do that. And so I've seen various responses to deconstruction. I think some people get it, some people don't. That's why honestly, I really liked your chapter in the book, because I think you kind of gave permission for people to ask questions without feeling that they were doing something wrong by asking questions. So I really, really appreciate that.
Thank you. I
So,
think there's something, I mentioned this earlier, but there's just something, and we don't always realize that we really are products of our culture and our age. And so we live in this, again, it's not just, I don't mean just 21st century America, but I mean, the modern age, which is 500 years long. We live in this culture where we think that we are supposed to have all the answers and to understand and to be able to explain. And just like a Lifetime television movie that sets up completely false expectations about what anything in the real world is like, that also sets up a false expectation. Like
right,
we are just not supposed to know everything. And that comes down to, I mean, ultimately it's a lack of humility.
right,
But it's partly just because of our culture's emphasis on knowing and explaining. But if we actually didn't have that expectation that we're supposed to have an answer for everything, then we might not be so disappointed or feel like it's a crisis. But here we are. We are creatures of our age, and so that's why I thought this book was important. It's just a little book, and there are others out there, but we need to know our age, we need to know our times, and we need to not mock people or dismiss them when they have these kinds of questions, and they go through this process, because in some ways, we've helped create the culture that makes that such a dramatic event in their lives. If we preach certainty, certainty, certainty all the time, then those moments of uncertainty are going to seem more like a crisis than they need to be.
Yeah, that's a great point. I totally agree with you, Karen, on that. I think that's actually one of the disservices we've done to people in our churches, is that we have, whether implicitly or whether on purpose, overtly or not, we send the message that we do have all the answers, that we do have it figured out, right? It's not that I've heard the phrase quoted quite often, like the opposite of faith is not doubt, it's certainty. Because once I'm certain, I don't need faith. I know I've got it figured out. And so, yeah, I would, because again, this takes me back to another point, or another, I guess, a comment or a question. Because one of the things near the beginning of the book, and I think it's even in the sort of description of the book on Amazon, it says something like church should be the safest place to ask questions. And it seems like what the book wants to do in general is to say to those who are deconstructing, hey, listen, don't leave the church if you're having these kinds of doubts and questions, right? And so, and I agree with that, except I know from experience, and I've talked to enough people that I could say, for a lot of people, they don't leave the church. I mean, they leave the church because the church isn't a safe place, right? In other words, hey, I tried to talk to my pastor. I asked him some questions. Sometimes it's the simplest question. It's like, hey, I don't understand what this verse means. And dude, you're a false teacher. You're a danger. You're a heretic. You can't teach Sunday school anymore. You're out of here. We can't have you, part of the leadership team anymore. So sometimes the reaction from the church is so against anybody having a doubt or a question that, people have felt like, in other words, the reason a lot of them are leaving the churches that I've seen is because church is not a safe place. They would love to stay there, right? If that was possible, but they either end up leaving the church because maybe on one level, they're just not comfortable anymore, because they just they have these questions, and then they kind of get the feeling that, well, I guess someone like me isn't welcome here, so I'll leave. And sometimes it's a very, very direct and very unmistakable, you need to go, invitation to leave, right? The right foot of fellowship. And so, so again, I agree in general with the statement, but my concern is, I guess my statement would be to churches and to pastors. And I have spoken to church leaders before, who actually have invited me to come and speak about deconstruction, sort of how do we fix the problem? And honestly, that's the thing I've told them, is that you need to be a safe place. Your church, you need to create a safe space in your church where someone could continue to come, continue to fellowship, continue to be a welcome member of that fellowship, even if they have questions, and you don't make them feel unwelcome, and you don't chase them away. And until your church becomes that safe place, then you're the one kicking them out. You're the reason why the attendance keeps going down, because you're the one driving them away. If you don't want that to happen, then you need to become a welcoming place so that they feel like, you know what, I don't have this figured out. I'm not sure what I believe about this anymore, but you know what? These people love me, and I still feel welcome here and loved and accepted. Like, if we could do that, I think that would be a wonderful thing. Like, I would just encourage any pastors, any churches, anyone in church leadership listening to this conversation, that really, I personally think that's the best response you can have to people in your church who are deconstructing or doubting and questioning. Go out of your way to make your church a safe place for people that are having those doubts and questions.
And then, and even another slight variation of that, based on my chapter on anti-intellectualism, is also, don't just be satisfied with the pat answer
Yes.
to someone. So someone might feel like they are a safe place, but they're just giving a pat answer that doesn't satisfy. And going, so it's okay to say, I just don't know, or I can't explain it, or I see it this way, but I realize that may not be enough for you. I mean, some of us are satisfied with certain answers. I think in some, I guess I'm a person who's pretty satisfied with just being able to say, I don't know why God allows this or does this. And I'm okay with that. But I also have to accept that other people are not. For other people, it's a real existential struggle. So I can't assume that my simple answer that works for me is going to answer someone else's question.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And see, I think that you make a good point there, Karen. I think a lot of churches would say, well, what do you mean? Like, we love questions, right? We welcome questions. And so they feel like, I know, I mean, I'm saying from experience, I've talked to people that have flat out said that, like, well, what do you mean we're a safe space? Like the youth pastor is, hey, kids in the youth group, you have questions about the doctrines, you have questions about the Bible, bring them on. I want to answer your questions. And so a lot of churches and pastors, they feel like they are a safe space because they do quite often say, hey, you ask your questions. But I think here's the little nuance that's different. We have to not just be comfortable with people asking questions, we have to be comfortable with them questioning. In other words,
Mm-hmm.
they have a question about a certain doctrine, right? Or why does God do this or that? Or I'm not sure I believe in this or that kind of thing anymore. And let's say you, as the pastor, you answered the question. So in your mind, I have answered the question, right?
Right.
But they're still going, yeah, I don't know. I'm still wrestling with that. I'm going to still chew on that. And so that's what I mean. That's the point
Right.
where you have to still be okay. You can't get
Right.
frustrated and say, now, wait a minute.
Right.
I gave you the answer and you either accept my answer or you're out of here. See, now you're not opening, right?
Mhm.
So that's what I'm saying. Like
Right.
that's where the rubber meets the road, is that they have a question, you give them what you believe is the perfect answer, right? It's straight out of Josh McDowell's Evidence Demands a Verdict. Right here, boom, there it is, right there. Question answered, problem solved. Well, for some people it might be.
Mhm.
And I spent many years in apologetics in college and all that stuff. And I definitely went through that phase where I thought, well, there's the answer right there. But for some people, it just isn't, right?
Right.
And they're going to take some time. And so let's go back to what you and I were talking about Jesus, right? Jesus was actually comfortable giving people questions to think about more than he gave them answers. And so, again, so if someone comes to us with questions and they're in a place of questioning, and I understand, by the way, I get why this is hard, right? I understand for a lot of pastors, this is really hard. It's a really challenging thing to think of. Like, can I really just allow people in my church to be running around questioning things? But I would also say this: those people are already there. Like, they already have those questions.
Mhm.
The fact that that a few of them are coming forward and asking you is just showing you that that's the tip of the iceberg.
Mhm.
So
Or if no one's coming forward with them, then you're really in trouble because they don't feel like they can.
right, exactly. So I think it's just so maybe, and this also goes back to something we were saying before. Like a lot of people that are deconstructing, you said in me comments like you should be talking or listening to people that are deconstructing more than like sort of writing books to them, right? So I think a lot of them would say, yeah, this kind of that same kind of idea, like if you really are concerned about what this deconstruction phenomenon that's going on, the best thing to do would just be to relax a little bit and listen to people, maybe engage in more dialogue, actual dialogue, not just talking but listening, and learning to let people kind of work it out, right? And let the Holy Spirit work it out.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I teach, among the things that I teach, I have to teach some grammar and punctuation when my students are writing. And I might get into, even on Twitter the other day, I got into a conversation about semicolons. No, the Oxford comma
Oh
and
boy.
semicolons. And there were a couple people who just didn't understand. And I explained it a couple of times and I think a light bulb went on. But like, it's just, it comes easily to me and it might not come easily to someone else. And, of course, matters of faith are much more important, but in all areas of life, some things just come more easily to people, and other things it takes a long time and they have to grapple with it. And we need to let them do that,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, exactly. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I really enjoyed this conversation, Karen. I love even that we started off talking about literature and the value of seeing things through other people's eyes, and um, kind of being allowing ourselves to be in a place where we can kind of see things from someone else's perspective. I think all those things are so helpful, and actually are very relevant to the kind of stuff we're talking about. So yeah, as people are deconstructing, we want to be able to provide safe spaces for them. I appreciate, again, the chapter that you wrote. I think it was really great, very helpful for anybody in these kinds of, who find themselves in these kind of places, and hopefully even for leadership in churches who are struggling with how to respond to it.
Yeah, and I think I mentioned before we started recording that has been some pushback on the book, by people who have undergone deconstruction, who didn't feel like they were part of the process, and I understand that. But I think it's a good little book. I wish people would read it first. The people who are contributing out of their own experiences and knowledge in those issues. And it's not just an us versus them paradigm. I mean, we all question, and we're in this together. And I would like people not to feel. I think they'll find that the book is welcoming to those kinds of questions. That's why the book is out there, because we do understand. Maybe we don't understand everything anyone's going through, but this is the thing that reading great literature shows us, is that there are very few new questions, nothing new under the sun. And so we can take comfort in that. Our struggles are uniquely our own, yet at the same time, we are not alone in asking these questions and having these struggles.
Yeah, absolutely. And that, I thank you. Yeah, that's one of the big things too. I think people really need to know when they are going through this process, is that that they're not alone. A lot of that's kind of probably the number one thing I hear from people, is that um, mostly because they don't know anybody in their zip code, who is asking similar questions. Now that doesn't mean they aren't any. It just means they don't know them, right? So
Right.
they feel isolated from those relationships that they had before. Um, and see, this is another aspect of it as well, that I think would be really good for us as Christians to recognize, is that um, so often our community and our connection with people is based on an agreement. You know what I mean? Like, as long as you agree with me on these 10 doctrines, whatever, we can go camping together, or we can have lunch together, right? Or have coffee together. But if you don't agree on 2 or 3 of those things, I can't go camping with you. I can't have coffee with you. Um, and so that's one thing that's what's really painful again. So it's not just from the leadership level, it's even just the one-to-one, the personal level, right? So people who have, when you start asking these questions and doubting some of your faith, some of the aspects or doctrines of your faith that you were raised in, and you experience that rejection from other believers, it's really painful, right? You just feel like, hey, I thought we were friends. We serve together, we work together, right? We're both Sunday school teachers together, or whatever it is. And now, because I've been honest with you about, I'm not sure I believe this anymore, or that anymore, I'm like rejected, right? And so feeling that rejection is one of the things that creates this isolation, and this fear and this pain. Um, so it's not just knowing that you're not alone. I think it's knowing that you're still loved and accepted, even if uh,
Yes.
you have those doubts and questions, right? Like, I'm with you, I'm your friend, I don't really care
Right.
about that. So
Yes.
I would just encourage anybody, if you have a friend who's asking those questions, don't cut them off just because they come to you and let you know, hey, I'm not sure what I believe anymore about this or that. Um, let's still love people for who they are. Again, Jesus should be our example, right? Jesus loved Samaritans who wildly diverged from the Jewish concepts of worship and who God was and what scriptures were the right ones and all that stuff, right? And yet Jesus was able to intentionally go and seek out someone like that. And I would just encourage us to do those kinds of things, to not let our beliefs, our differences in beliefs, create this division in the body of Christ. I think we see this all the time, also even in the New Testament, right? Paul quite often. I love this that he does this a couple of times, right? When he'll write to a church, like in Rome or Corinth, and acknowledge, hey, you guys are arguing over the communion, or you're arguing over, should you eat meat sacrificed to idols? And he doesn't. He just says, some of you believe this, some of you believe that, and and instead of saying these guys are right and you guys are wrong, he just acknowledges, some of you think this, some of you think that. Let everyone be convinced in their own mind, but be one, right? Recognize your unity in Christ. Right. And if we could get back to that, where we valued unity in the body of Christ, where we valued that love and the connection with brothers and sisters in Christ, and allowed other people to have, some of you are convinced of this, some of you are convinced of that. There was no split of the church of like, we're now the church of those that eat meat sacrificed to idols, and we're the church of those who don't. That's not the goal. Like that, we don't even need to go that way. We can actually still maintain our unity in Christ, because we are all one, Paul says, in Christ, even though we might be Jew, Gentile, slave, free, male, female, young, old, right. Whatever those divisions right. are, yet we are all one in Christ. And so as long as Christ can remain the center for us, we can maintain that unity. I would just encourage us to seek that and to find ways to do that.
Mm-hmm. And that requires us keeping our eyes on Christ.
Yes. Yes, it does. Keeping our eyes on Christ, not necessarily our doctrines or our beliefs or any of those
divisions
things.
And
yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Well, Karen, this has been a blessing. I appreciate your time. Thank you so much. I'm glad we finally got to talk.
I am as well. This was delightful. I hope it's encouraging and edifying to those listening.
Yeah, awesome. Well, you have a great day. I know you've got a whole bunch of Zoom calls scheduled. I'll let you go. And thank you so much again. And we'll hopefully do this again sometime.
Bless you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.